current Vice President of the American Association of Geographers, and I have the enormous honor of introducing these two awesome women up here on the stage. So we are here to celebrate the Stanley Brunn Award for Creativity in Geography, and it's presented annually to an individual geographer or team who has demonstrated originality, creativity, and significant intellectual breakthroughs in geography. Wearing red shoes doesn't hurt. So Dr. Susanna Hecht is this year's recipient of the Brunn Award. She is a professor of urban planning and director of the Center for Brazilian Studies in the Department of Urban Planning at the UCLA School of Public Policy and Social Research. Dr. Hecht has dedicated herself to advancing the understanding of political ecologies, soil chemistry, present dynamics, and history of deforestation and reforestation in the Amazon. She has contributed critical research towards changing the policies and market incentives that cause widespread destructive deforestation in previous decades. Her work sheds light on more than a century of forest and land use change in the Amazon, helping us to determine a path for renewal and protection. I am particularly honored to be up here introducing her because her combination of political ecology and soil science was hugely important to me in graduate school as a constant reminder that the message that you can't combine critical human geography and physical geography is just wrong. So I remember holding her paper up and being like, look, Dr. Hecht could do this. I can try too. So then the person who is going to be interviewing and talking with Dr. Hecht on our behalf is Dr. Antoinette Winkler-Prinz, the Deputy Director of the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences Division of the Science. That's a lot to say. I'm going to try that sentence one more time. Please excuse me. All right. The Deputy Division Director of the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences Division of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate of the National Science Foundation. I wasn't kidding. It was a little bit of a thank you.
It's well done.
Yes, okay. So she has served since 2019 as the Deputy Division Director, and prior to coming to NSF, she was in the Geography Department at Michigan State, and while also serving as core faculty for the Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies, Gender and Global Context, the Center for Advanced Study of International Development, and the Environmental Sciences and Policy Program. And I will say that Dr. Winkler-Prinz has been an important role model for me and for many other geographers, demonstrating that it's possible to balance fascinating academic research and substantial public service. And I will note that she is also going to be an AAG National Counselor starting next year. So the way this will run is that the two of them will talk, have an interview for about 40 minutes, and then after that, you'll notice that there are several mics up here. Looks like there are two right in the center aisle. Those are so you can ask questions and join in the conversation. So as you're listening, I want you to be thinking about things that you really wish you could ask Dr. Hecht so we can keep that rolling, all right? So with great respect, I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Hecht and Dr. Winkler-Prinz.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm really thrilled to have been asked to do this because Susanna was an absolute role model for me as well when I was a grad student. And I remember reading her dissertation in a grad seminar, I think it was, maybe one with Bill Denovan, where he always would direct us to going to the original source. And then Susanna came to Madison. You were probably giving a talk, and we had breakfast one morning. You may not even remember this, Susanna, but I do, because it was extremely formative, because you gave me inspiration to pursue that mixture of soil science with social science, and I pursued a dissertation in the Brazilian Amazon, and to the extent my service commitments at NSF allow me to still dabble in some work on Amazonian dark earths. I still identify as an Amazonianist, as does Susanna. So she and I met over soils, and I would like to start by grounding us in those. It's a topic that has been of interest to both of us. But how did you get started looking at soils in the Amazon?
Well, I'm just checking this is on, yes? Okay, great. Part of it had to do with if you're trying to explain tropical forests and their dynamics, it's very difficult unless you're a sophisticated tropical botanist to understand what the species list means. You know, the average person could never understand this. Whereas if soil nutrients went up or went down, this was a rather easy way to explain the questions about changes and in the resource base in the natural world in a way that was intelligible to most people. The other thing is that there had been, of course, a very long history of soil determinism about Amazonia, which basically was advanced by a person named Betty Meggers, who was an archaeologist, who managed to ignore so much data that was held in terms of artifacts and beautiful materials in the various museums in Brazil. But her argument was essentially that you could never develop complex cultures in Amazonia because the soils were so crummy. And so this sort of put this back into some kind of a Stone Age thing. And so she wrote a very famous book called, you know, Man and Nature, or Nature and Culture, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise. And its companion piece was The Fierce People, about sort of the brutality and barbarity of the Yanomami. So the point was that if you couldn't develop complex cultures, they would always be in some kind of pre-civilizational thing. In many ways, kind of echoing within the context of cultural ecology, the statement made by the original Brazilian explorers, which is that Amazonia was a place sem rei, sem fé e sem lei, that is, without king, without laws, and without creed. So it was like a cultural void. And in the concept of a cultural void meant that actually, of course, you could do whatever you wanted, so you could shape the world as you wished. So in a certain sense, while Betty Meggers made the argument that, well, it's so crappy you could never possibly get development there, it was a stimulus to another kind of form of development, which we might think of as sort of Amazonian green revolution in the sense of modernist monocultural agriculture. And that began to be one of the major drivers. And also the idea that the population was crummy and so on meant that it really didn't have anything there, meant, of course, that it could be snapped up by anybody, terra nullius. And so for geopolitical reasons, for a number of other reasons, I won't go into them, the military dictatorship sort of went in with guns blazing, so to speak. So that's where it really comes from, which is kind of using, so the question was, well, if it's so crappy, why are there all these amazing artifacts? Why is it so culturally rich at the indigenous level if there was never any civilization? And if this development is supposed to be so great, how come the soils are degrading very rapidly? So that's the origin story, really. And if I might point out, some of the counterpoints to this origin story come from Antoinette's work on Amazonian dark earths, women in urban areas, and also some of my work among the Kayapo, women working in agricultural areas, about how Amazonian dark earths were formed. And those are highly fertile anthropogenic soils. Now, many of you, I know that there are many people here who already know this narrative, but for those who don't, what's important about Amazonian dark earths, and you know, we're sort of, the research has gone wildly forward, but what's important about it is this. If you think about places that really shouldn't have complex civilizations, like mountain areas, or places that are really arid, then then you shouldn't have civilization in places that have terraces or irrigation. So in this certain sense, Terra Preta, Amazonian dark earths, can be seen as a technological equivalent for occupying a place which has serious soil and resource restraints in terms of agriculture and other kinds of things, but is certainly capable of producing surplus. So it's an extraordinary rebuttal, and again, Antoinette is right, is right there, to this soil determinist argument. So, as I say, this is where the origin story is. But that Terra Preta stuff, as well as a lot of archaeological work, was really instrumental in changing the paradigms about what Amazonia is and could be.
All right, thank you, Susanna. You are receiving this award, and congratulations, first of all. I don't think I've said that directly to you, so congratulations on that. It is meant to reflect the broad breadth of the work that you have produced. And my guess is that most of us in the room, at minimum, know Fate of the Forest, and there's been a book that has been around and is so universal now in its use, but there is much more that you have produced. And so I'd like you to just reflect a little bit that from your perspective, what of your work has been most impactful? And from your perspective, and then perhaps the outside, those looking into your work, is that the same work or is it a different work?
Well, of course, I love Fate of the Forest because it has, it's like, well, some might say an enduring curse, but it's gone on forever. It just came out again in Portuguese a few months ago. But what is important about it is that the work continues historically to be very strong. And I think the point that I'd like to make, particularly for people who are new scholars, is that doing really good work, and the nature of political ecology is that it has a lot of history in it. So that in a certain sense, you can think of political ecologies and the questions they raise about justice and about alternative ways of seeing the world, different epistemes, different ontologies. Those things can be quite durable, even though the world goes on and does different kinds of things. So from that perspective, it's always been a wonderful thing to have done. But it also stimulated another book, which I had the problem of that I fell in love with Euclides da Cunha, the great Brazilian writer. And for those of you who are Brazilianists, you'll know that he wrote one of the iconic books called Rebellion in the Backlands, is the American translation. Os Sertões is the term in Portuguese, the backlands. But in which an uprising is just slaughtered by a new emerging state. And it's a brutal story, and he was meant to be, because he was a journalist writing for the military, it was meant to be a sort of triumphal story about, military triumph and the rise of, the rise of the new republic. But what it was, in his view, was something that sort of turned triumph on its head. And he wanted to write another book about those same people who ended up being sort of captured and taken off to Amazonia, or themselves going to Amazonia because of the periodic Enso droughts that made livelihoods really difficult. So he wrote a lot about Amazonia, but unfortunately never wrote what I'm sure would have been his magnus opus on Amazonia, which he was going to call the Lost Paradise, or Paraíso Perdido. But he had all these little pieces of it. And so it seemed interesting to me to follow these along and see what was he doing, because he was sort of a cipher in terms of Amazonian studies. So I pulled together most of his writings on Amazonia. Unfortunately, he didn't write his book about the Amazon because he was killed by his wife's much younger lover. But his life itself and what he was writing about was absolutely inspirational, and in my view, the best writing on Amazonia, bar none. But there's other work that I like a lot too, which actually is not so specifically Amazonia. It comes out of Central America, which is about the dynamics of forest resurgence. And while accustomed as we are to doom and gloom, there's also a great deal of forest recovery that goes on in these vibrant tropical landscapes. So one of the things that one of the books that I like, which is a compendium with someone who's, neither of my co-authors are here, but Christine Paddock, who's an anthropologist who worked a lot in Amazonia, in the estuary and in the Western Amazon, and also an archaeologist. And I think that sort of exemplifies the kind of cross-disciplinary thinking that I think is so necessary to understand tropical dynamics, because they really are different. That book is called The Social Lives of Forests. And so rather than thinking of forests as kind of a nature apart, it's that they are part of a social matrix. And so in that sense, it's it's one of these collections. So it's not so, the narrative line is not so clear. But what it does do, because it does this all over the world, is describe this extraordinary relationship of tropical peoples with their landscapes and the creation of these, and how also various kinds of dynamics, which we have the habit of thinking of the tropics as only sites of horrors and degradation, all of which is true, are also sites of extraordinary recovery as well. So I like that one I like these as well. So, and then I'm working on a third book, which is actually, if we take The Scramble for the Amazon as the first book, Fate of the Forest as the second, this next one that I'm working on now is supposed to be sort of about the trilogy of the sort of long Amazonian century or century and a half, whatever. Starts in 1988, a year in which the internet was invented, the IPCC happened, the Soviet Union fell, and the Brazilian constitution was instituted, and it meant the end of authoritarian period. And it was widely reproduced, and it was important in the broader decline in authoritarianism in the greater Amazon biome. Still remains complicated, but still.
Susanna, you've already alluded to this a little bit in your comments on soils, but during the time that we've been working in Amazonia, there have been tremendous changes in paradigms on the way that Amazonia is framed, and your work has significantly contributed to this. Share with us some more thoughts about this, particularly the role that geographers have played in this process.
Well, I think part of it is that geographers are among the least siloed of disciplines. So we could call them undisciplined, I suppose. So there's that. And they're a little more free range. And so the other thing is that there's a strong sense of history in these kinds of, in geography in general. So in terms of these paradigms, one of the things is that geographers pay attention to landscape. The other thing is that they pay attention to time. And the other thing is they keep their eyes open. I mean, your mentor and mine, Bill Denovan, was flying over the Western Amazon and saw all these extraordinary causeways and stuff in a place which, again, was not supposed to be capable of producing anything remotely important in terms of civilization. Denovan also was very interested in the management of secondary, after shifting cultivation and stuff, all in the management of forests and so on. I'm mentioning this because there's a very excellent book edited by my colleague here. And, it's on display, and I urge you to get your own copy. I got mine, and anyway. The point being here that there's a lot of stuff that goes on, and most of the paradigms haven't captured the expansiveness of it. So in the training of geographers, I think that you get encouraged to be more expansive. The other thing is that there is this really rich geographic heritage of exploration, and that can be both exploration of archives, it can be exploration of data sets, and exploration of physical places. So Amazonians and geographers like to do that. But the issue about cartography, I happen to have picked up a book on Jesuit cartography this very day, so I'm probably a little perverse on this. But the other thing is that one of the things that it's not just it's soils that have been important in these transformations. It's Landsat and satellite imagery and remote sensing imagery as being means through which you can document change. And of course, these become incredibly important tools for geographers. So in a certain sense, you can go from soils to satellites in geography, and there really aren't very many other disciplines where you can do that. And you can also go from climate change to current volatility, and there aren't many disciplines where you can do that. But you have to be friends with a lot of other disciplines and be happy to read in them, and also to critique a lot of the paradigms that are used for understanding current dynamics, because a lot of them will elude the models that we are generating here in the temperate zone.
All right. Susanna, you are considered one of the founders of political ecology, and share with us some thoughts you have about that field. As we were just chatting here, as we were preparing for this session, that the Cultural and Political Ecology Specialty Group, I think, Rebecca, you were saying, is one of the largest in the AAG. So it's been around a while, and Susanna is one of the founders of that framing and that perspective. And so what are some of your thoughts of how that has evolved and where it's going?
Well, first of all, it has always had a historical dimension, and I mention this again because I think we're so locked into the sort of contemporary moment. We can thank social media for that. But the other thing, so one of the things is that there's been a recuperation of a lot of history. We can think about indigenous history, we can think about Black history, we can think about feminism, we can think about traditional peoples, we can think about religious minorities. There's all sorts of kinds of histories that are kind of emergent in terms of how resources and politics, and again, epistemes and ontologies, how you see the world, how you are in the world, and their meanings in landscapes, and how they bump up against sort of dominant dynamics of development, if we can think of that. So one of the things is this thing about occluded histories and invisibilities. It would be remiss if I didn't mention climate change. We can think about Michael Watt's Silent Violence, which of course was about the Sahel and the climate thing, but it was not actually within this dominant, what is now dominant understanding of planetary change. So in this sense, I think we now see things not just in terms of like local outcomes, which is sort of where the methodologies allowed us to work before, but now with greater expansion at planetary level. So people never used to talk about climate justice, but now it's, of course, a central topic about understanding, excuse me, the impact of climate change, and also the variability of the dynamics of climate change, which is very important. And also what political ecology does is it always puts class and capitalism and other forms of resource use and resource dominate and human domination in the picture, so that it's not just sort of random things like markets, disembodied markets that go and do this, that they're actual actors. And speaking of actors, one thing I think that we can thank the late Bruno Latour for is the idea, it's not that people didn't think that the environment was meaningful or impactful. I mean, you can think of the long history in geography of environmental determinism, but the problem was that it was like too monolithic. What Bruno Latour points out is that, first of all, there are cultures of science, so science and technology studies, which now are really important in excuse me, in political ecology, but also that there are actants, non-human things that impact human life, impact how we are in the world. And you don't need to do, those of us who have come here from Los Angeles, and its incessant atmospheric rivers can tell you that, as someone once said, nature has a vote here. And so as an actant in terms of structuring daily life, in terms of structuring economic life. Right now, we can't possibly turn our backs on climate as an actant, and that was something that was not really in the mix. So I've mentioned climate, actants, history, and hidden histories, and new ways of seeing the world. Again, the competing epistemologies, competing ontologies, different ways of being in the world, which have become more important as we sort of look at our fossil-based world as being perhaps having some problems about, one, reductionism and how we understand the world, and second, that perhaps this way of being is not going to get us to the end of the century in any lovely way. In Amazonian debates, the issues of ontologies of indigenous populations have always been part of the debate, always been a critique of indigenous populations against forms of development, not just because of their insane brutality and racism against indigenous populations and quilombolas. These are the slave, Afro-descendant communities and traditional communities. But that actually it's not just, it's being in a society of nature. It's not just a question of perfecting within a given system. So these are the kinds of things that we can see. We can also see feminism. We can also see that new techniques and technologies have really made a difference in terms of, of these kinds of questions. I've mentioned remote sensing. Obviously, the expansion of computer capabilities has made an enormous difference in terms of how political ecology goes forward. But it has a bunch of new sort of analytic apparatuses that can be invoked in this too. So, and also a planetary consciousness.
Thank you.
That's all that's new in political ecology.
A two-part question. I've always been impressed with how you have sustained your scholarship and its diversity in what you have produced and your amazing creative integration of material. Where do you get your inspiration? And how can you advise scholars today, where can they continue to find sources of inspiration to remain active scholars in the way that you have been?
Well, the first thing I would say, and this will cause a certain hilarity among my colleagues here, I'm a bad bureaucrat. I'm just, some people are excellent at it. But I'm sort of like a stunned bird when it comes to bureaucracy. So that's the secret to my success. But the other thing is that I get up from my computer and walk the dog a lot, partly because he's, old and incontinent, so getting up sort of avoids other kinds of tragedies. But walking around in nature is helpful. I read very widely and from across a lot of different disciplines. I didn't mention in the last answer to my question how important I feel the environmental humanities have been in terms of like giving you new frameworks. Just even novels are very useful in this, but think about the history of science. Think about science and technology studies. Think about some of these really interesting sort of takes on different moments in time. Those have been very inspirational. And then, as I say, reading the explorers. I just happened to read Ulrich Schmiedel in the last month. And if you're saying, who's Ulrich Schmiedel? I don't blame you. He was a mercenary in 1540 in coming up the Paraná River to conquer Quito. And he missed the Pizarro brothers beat him to it. And that expedition. But one of the things is that if you look at these older things, what you see is that they were actually really excellent observers. So it's real. Not only do I happen to find expeditionary literature kind of fun, but it's also very useful in terms of being able to monitor kinds of change and durability. for the same particular article, I was also reading Triste Tropique by Claude Lévi-Strauss, and which I recommend also to everyone, both of which I recommend. I mean, Schmiedel his book was a smash, and partly because he was just talking about how amorous all those Amazonian women were, which compared to the sort of Catholic women of Germany might have been like an incredible relief. But also it describes a kind of different way of being in the world, which he was like, well, he was delighted by it, but he was also sort of cognizant of this. And then you have somebody who's going through the same trajectory, weirdly enough, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who's meeting up with the same people that Ulrich met up with, but talking also about the kind of cultural durability that occurred in Amazonia. And one of the things I think that we can see now in the Amazonian context, or in a great deal of the sort of tropical context, is that what we imagine to be the disappearing Indians and the sort of cultural degradation, and this is not to say that that didn't happen, but there was also quite a bit of ethnogenesis, but also cultural recomposition and cultural animation and recuperation that occurred. And now we see the sort of institutionalization of this in Brazil with the Sonia Guajajara in the indigenous ministry, and with Joania Wapichana being the head of FUNAI. So we're seeing that actually, instead of that these cultural traditions, in which actually women have played a very strong role, which has not been very carefully elucidated, although our friend and colleague Manuela Peak is one of the few people who's worked on indigenous women in the politics, and I think there's a smattering of a few other people who have done this. But the point is that there's more cultural resilience than one might expect. And it is that it might be sort of a central platform for rethinking forms of Amazonian development. And we've certainly been arguing that for quite some time, mostly falling on deaf ears, but nonetheless.
Susanna, in your reflections on political ecology, you mentioned the increasing importance of technology. But here you're talking about reading deeply into old documentations of expeditions, et cetera. What do you see as the role of field work in the work that we do in the political ecology Amazonian space?
Well, I think field work is pretty essential, partly because we all have our own little imaginaries of place. And for most people, Amazonia is like a green blob. So, if you don't go there, it's hard to get beyond the sort of green blobbiness of it, and then whatever anybody has said about that green blob. The other thing is that there's many things that you miss if you're not there. It's like you have to show up. And you can see this. I work a lot with remote sensors, and, really, it's been so transformative. But if they don't go to the field, they don't really understand what they're seeing. And which is why you have a lot of geographers and historians and others on those teams, because just looking at stuff you can't, from a distance, you can't really understand its dynamics. And field work also requires that you listen to people, and that your version of what's going on is perhaps not the only one that is acting in the world. So this is the other thing that's really important. And the other thing is that there's lots of things that you can't see from a distance, and can't feel from a distance. And also you need to, I'll just give you a quick example, which is in looking at Kayapo soil management with Daryl Posey. One of the things, it basically, the thing on shifting cultivation was basically, well, you burned it, and then you burned it once, and then that was that, and then the stuff grew back, and then you abandoned the field. And what we found is that the whole region was burning all the time. And so, but not in these hot fires, but in these fires that you could walk through. Children were like with their little Bics burning little areas and so on. And so, although in another time that would have been like a burning brand. But what you could see is that the model of, that had been promoted, which seemed to be perfectly reasonable and had been repeated zillions of times, wasn't up to it wasn't accurate, because what was going on, what we were seeing, completely defied the reality of the words with the reality itself defied the models. So part of it is that being in the field tells you a lot more about what's going on, and it also permits you to challenge theory, and also gives you mechanisms through which you can begin to understand things more broadly. So the biochar stuff, of course, became so important as part of this renunciation of the soil determinist model in Amazonia about why it couldn't have complex civilizations.
So besides paradigm shifts and changes in epistemologies in the Amazon, it is, of course, a contested space in so many ways. Tell us your thoughts about soy, cattle, the future.
Well, I left my crystal ball at home. I was packing hastily, and you know how that can happen. This could happen to anyone. So one of the things that I have learned from Amazonia, and I know you have learned from Amazonia too, and others in here who work in Amazonia, is you can always be surprised. So one of the big surprises in this century was that from 2004 to 2014, or 2012, depends on this little tail that you look at, Amazonian deforestation declined by 80%. Now, in 2002, I would certainly, when it would look, it looked like it was just going to go in the great acceleration into the moon, you wouldn't have predicted that. So there were a lot of things that had to come into explaining it. And the politics of the time was important. The institutional creation at the time was important. The rise of social movements and so on were important. Changing policy was important. There were many, many elements that went into this transformation. But you wouldn't have predicted it from you would have seen volatility and deforestation, but not that big collapse. Well, when you put in Mr. Bolsonaro, and then it starts to go up again. So that tells you something about politics and regimes and patterns of regulation. So that's one thing. The Amazonia right now is largely reflecting internal colonialism of its pan-Amazonian countries. Its economies are very largely writ in clandestine economies, as the capacity to provide employment for Amazonian working people has sort of evaporated for a number of reasons which we can't go into here. But you want to think about the labor demands in coca and the value of its return, the labor demands in clandestine gold, which is vast, and also this is an extraordinarily toxic land use. Land grabbing, also wildly important in terms of deforestation, and the expansion of the coca economy, or the timber economy, excuse me, which is sort of linked to all of these. So one of the things is that you have sort of a Hayekian dream of unfettered capitalism, I guess, but it's all clandestine, and much of it's toxic as well. Certainly a lot of glyphosate has been sprayed over the Andean Amazon for control of coca. Mercury has contaminated huge amounts of those rivers. And then even the legal economy is sort of a death and doom economy with the use of pre-emergent herbicides like glyphosate, so, which is considered to be a carcinogen by the World Health Organization, if you trust the World Health Organization, as we have been told not to. But the point that I'd like to make is that there are always things that are burbling up in in Amazonian history, and there's a lot of things that you can't really predict. Right now, it's sort of in a, I wouldn't want to say a doom spiral, but it's in a very difficult, particular historical moment with many other things going on. What we might have predicted 5 years ago would be the worst place, which is Colombia, turns out to be one of the best stories we have going in Amazonia right now. But I'll defer now to, of course, Euclides da Cunha, who always said, looking at Amazonia, first of all, that it's the last unfinished page of Genesis. And the second thing is, such is the river, such is its history, always turbulent, always insurgent. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Susanna, very much. We will now open up to questions. So if you have a question for Susanna, please step up to a mic and go ahead. Step up to a mic. And Rebecca, you'll moderate.
I will moderate.
Great, if we can see.
Yeah, we're
Yeah. Is it not
Not
on?
yet. They'll probably turn it on.
Could a tech
should
person
be
in the
gone.
back turn
Try
on the
again.
microphone for us?
Try again. It's on.
yeah.
Hi, I'm Annabelle Ford, and I work
Hi.
in another tropical world, but there's a number of common threads, and I'm an archaeologist, and you brought in archaeology, and I have many questions, but one I thought would be really relevant about fire. You cannot live in the tropical forest without using fire. You simply have to clear and open up spaces for your home, for everything else. And I've been looking at the regenerative Swidden system, which has been maligned as a shifting agriculture, which really is an asynchronous cycle of land use that employs fire for opening up the crops and uses succession and maturing for the kinds of construction, perennial fruits, whatever you want to say, that are useful as well as habitat for animals. And I am thinking also of Harold Conklin, who defined what two kinds of Swidden, we'll just say, I'm sure it's a continuum, but the embedded integral type and the, incipient, whatever, that is just, I need food in 60 days. So I started thinking fire might have been a really reduction of fuel and creating, since it would be a cycle, creating a way that even fires could never become what they have been. So I'd like you to comment on fire.
Well, I'm a big fan of fire. I know this comes as a shock to Californians, but you have a lot of trouble. One of the things that was interesting about working with both traditional peoples and indigenous people is how much they use fire. And it's not the sort of, horrible, massive fires that we now see, but there's in-field burning, there's burning under forests, there's burning of grasslands, there's burning in order to shape the landscape. And if it's much more efficient than trying to do this by hand. So in a certain sense, you have to look at the fire as a kind of mechanization of the landscape using, but it's like mechanization in that it can impact much more area than and much more efficiently than doing it manually. So one of the things is that you just see fire in, if you look at the paleoecologies and the lake sediments and so on, such as they are, what you see is the use of fire. But what's interesting about this, and this is also, again, the whole question of the new technologies, and I haven't really mentioned the use of paleontological techniques and other kinds of archaeological techniques, which have been so amazing. But one of the things that you see is you'll see a lot of charcoal, but you won't see a lot of loss of forest. So that in a certain sense, you did the Neolithic revolution, and there's a great paper about this by Eduardo Neves, which is, was there a Neolithic revolution in Amazonia? And the answer is not like the way we see it. Your point about how these things are used to create different kinds of landscapes and forests and other kinds of things, I remember very distinctly a Kayapo woman saying to me, well, we have agriculture so we can get the forest we want. And this, of course, aligns with the more historical ethnobotany and historical ecology that is really indicating that Amazonia was an anthropogenic landscape, that it comes out of its distribution of trees, its distribution of useful trees, its sort of long-term history, and also the paleontological stuff that goes with it and the fire stuff that goes with it, indicates a really extraordinary, different kind of environmental and possibly political history. Some of you might know the work of David Graeber, who died recently, whose book with an archaeologist, David Wengrove, is called The Dawn of Everything. And one of the things he makes is that if we have a sort of narrative about how inequality is sort of by definition part of the Neolithic revolution and the rise of agriculture. But there can be domestication without agriculture, and this is another story that Amazonia is revealing as we speak, actually. And so the Neolithic revolution, as we understand it, may be completely wrong, as you mentioned, and that the need, because of the really intense climatic events and ecosystem events of, you know, this giant rivers rising and falling in areas that had been not flooded, suddenly becoming flooded, that there's a kind of mobility thing that may give you sort of different kinds of hierarchies or even non-hierarchies in these systems, that the so-called semi-nomadic stuff might be actually a means in which you always, you might be able to reconfigure what complex societies might mean and what hierarchies might mean. So there's a kind of rethinking about sort of forms of civilization that are not based on annual cropping per se, but on a broad array of ecological products. And also that these systems are all based on high levels of diversity rather than the simplification that goes with the Neolithic revolution. There certainly is plenty of evidence and also demographic evidence that there were complex societies, and certainly the Arawak world extended all the way into Florida. So and the Arawak are a major group in Amazonia, for those of you who don't sit and read up on Arawak, in Amazonian linguistic groups, which, you know, I don't know why you wouldn't know that, but, you know, but the point is that it was an extensive and expansive cultural system, and also the artifacts from it really support this view. Unfortunately, many of them burned up in the burning up of the Brazilian National Museum, but that's another story.
All right, please. Would you mind coming forward? Thank you.
So thank you for a really interesting discussion. I'm Bill Mosley. I'm at Macalester College.
Hi.
I'm an Africanist, but I've long followed your work. I want to return to this question that Antoinette asked you about fieldwork. And in cultural and political ecology, this has long been a subject of debate, but I feel like there are new concerns about greenhouse gas emissions related to, traveling around the world to do field work, and also this critique that field work is sort of inherently colonial. And I, like you, I think, I can't imagine doing what I do without doing field work because it challenges a lot of my assumptions and ideas, and I think I'm struggling with these sort of new critiques, and I'd be interested to see how you're thinking about them. Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. Certainly, a lot. Geographers were never part of some colonial project. You must be mad. No, I mean, the problem that we have is that many disciplines have a colonial legacy. What is now, but the thing about challenging the assumptions that one has, I think, is really part of the decolonial dynamic of how we work in the world. The other thing that we really see going on in a lot of Amazonian research is having our field assistants and informants put on papers and so on, going to meetings like this and so on. There's big meetings. The last meeting I went to in Brazil, like half of it was indigenous and traditional people and other people from Amazonia. So one of the things is to sort of recognize the importance of indigenous knowledge and that actually it may be further along in terms of understanding these places than ourselves. So there's the question of appropriation of these things, but Daryl Posey, with whom I worked, was one of the first people to take indigenous people to the World Bank and show them the projects. It predated the ILO, 169 informed consent thing. If he hadn't done the field work among the Kayapo, that process, which flawed as it may be, really has been important, and it's been important in terms of indigenous people's ability to legally challenge certain kinds of projects because they weren't included in the discussions. The other thing is as my colleague here just mentioned, there's lots of things that you don't know, that you can't know from saying, I'm not going to go there because it'll be imperial or I'm going to have emissions. I don't know, plant some more trees and, I don't know quite what to say. We're still in a high emissions period, so in some sense, do what you can to reduce emissions, but as we know, the emissions dynamic goes with income. So higher income populations are doing more of this. More of the release of CO2. But in terms of understanding climate change, it's been really important for people who study climate change in the Arctic to have a chat with and to include in the treaty formation and discussion of the science and the implications of climate change in the Arctic. This is also true in Amazonia, where now, because these people have a historical understanding of what it used to be like and how different it is. And we can sit there with our satellites and say, well, so there's this that's going away. But the implications of it are much more profound. And also because of the sort of ecological understanding that lots of different kinds of people who live in localities have, they are able to tell us what is going on. So, like Ailton Krenak points out, a forest is one thing. It has plants, it has animals, and it has people. And you need all of those, and you need people to tell you what's going on in these changing dynamics that we have. So I think it's convenient to say, well, it's a colonial enterprise. But perhaps it's at a planetary level, we need to be respecting this information a lot more. And there's lots of ways in which we can be more, we can honor this kind of information a lot more and give it more prominence. It's for this reason I'm a member of the scientific panel on the Amazon. about 10% of the scientists were indigenous people. About half of the scientists were also women. But the other thing is that it really keeps going back and hammering on this idea that indigenous knowledge is perhaps more profound in its ability to understand some of these dynamics than what we call normal science.
Other questions?
Oh,
Or-
Here we go.
Yeah,
Great.
Jackie, go.
All right, I'm Jackie Vajunic from Oklahoma State. I have a little story first. At a conference in Waterloo on water futures last summer, we were asked to, as an icebreaker, to tell a book that changed our lives. My book was Fate of the Forest. I bought that off the shelf at Barnes & Noble. I was going to get an MFA in creative writing, and that book made me a geographer. And right after, so thank you for that, and also an Amazon.
have I cursed you in some way? I
So
thought I
then,
was
but
your
right
friend.
after me was Wendy Jepson, and she said, she took my book, it's the same book. So there were two of us who you changed our lives, so I thank you for that. But my question is this, that book was so amazing in part because you worked with a journalist. So I have worked with a journalist once, and we've played back and forth about writing a book on the Great Plains. He's an award-winning journalist. I gave him one of my papers that was to be proofed, and he gave it back to me 12 hours later. He spent 12 hours rewriting the abstract. So my question is this, I think geographers should be working more with journalists, but how do you do that? Because we work so differently, right?
Well, I work a lot with a journalist named Charles Mann as well, and other journalists. And you're going to hear from a great journalist tomorrow or Sunday, Rebecca Solnit. So one of the things is make friends with journalists. But also working with journalists is interesting because I have also done that as well. And part of it is that they are, as they say, writing the first draft of history, but you can't write a draft of history without a history. So what one sort of does is you do a lot of orientation. And also, and we have used, geographers in Amazonia work a lot with Charles Mann because he wrote that wonderful book, 1491 and 1493, in which geographers figure prominently. And everybody loves him because he was so interested in this work. So one of the things, and also helped make it more, in some ways, more interesting for us. Because, he's, wow, look at these, like there are these, like there are these geoglyphs all over the place, instead of what we were talking about is like causeways and, these other mounds. Wow, there's cocoa on them. Like that kind of thing. And suddenly the sort of excitement that journalists need to be excited about things because otherwise they don't have a job. So they help you be more excited about your own work, I think. And so make friends. This is another recommend. You be a bad bureaucrat. Make friends with journalists because they will also animate your own work and they'll ask questions that, anyone who isn't, inculcated in our own work might ask of us. And you have to come up with an answer that would make sense to a person who's not so imbricated and not so immersed in the work. So that they're very useful, and they're all over the place, and you can, they're on the internet, amazingly enough, and you can just email them and say, what are you in, because many of them are interested in climate change. Many of them are interested in land use change. They're interested in social justice. They're interested in what the changing world, which is, after all, the big theme of geography, what the changing world is producing. So, and many of you have work here that would be of interest to journalists. So just write them. And, they don't have to answer back, but many of them will be intrigued. The other thing is that your universities can help you out here. There's that, because somebody's got to produce content, right? And we have all these organizations within our universities that are spewing out, oh, I don't know, the latest something. But they should be paying a little bit more attention to the geographic content about the changing world in which we're all living under the Great Acceleration. And so start nagging them. As a center director, I'm making sure that every time there's anything interesting on Brazil, it gets posted and it gets tweeted. Not that I do any of this, by the way. I have somebody who will handle the world of tweets, because if I did that, I would be the babbling, insane person. But many departments, I also work part of the year in Switzerland. We have a person, so whenever there's an interesting paper that comes out and stuff, it's tweeted out. So, although or mammoth out, you know, the mammoth footprint, whatever. But that you use your institutional capacities and institutional relations, because it's much too much to demand of our time for us to do this as well as everything else. But the institutions can help you. But you have to, as they say, feed the machine. So that's another thing. And then some journalists will call you up.
All right, I'm going to pull moderator's prerogative to ask one last question.
Sure.
A lot of the conversation in sessions I attended yesterday was about relationships between Western science and indigenous knowledge, and it's something you've mentioned as well. And I wonder if you have thoughts or examples about ways to bring different knowledges into conversation in ways that kind of, you know, don't make one the measure of the other, and like how to do that productively.
Well, probably the best example of this actually comes from Arctic research, because they have used, and the sort of pan-Arctic treaties and all of those kinds of, there's a whole political apparatus that goes along with the sort of pan-Arctic stuff. They have been much better at saying, well, yeah, we know that there's this big change, you know, in terms of climate, but we don't really know what it means. We don't know what it means for the animals. We don't know what it means for the plants. We don't know what it means for melting permafrost. We don't know. So can you help us out here? So in this sense, they are much more humble than a lot of other kinds of groups. The other thing is that in Amazonia right now, there's a lot of training of indigenous and Afro-descendant and traditional people's students, with the idea that they then work as, if you will, translators between quote-unquote normal science and indigenous science. But also people have been doing, Darryl Posey, of course, had this thing called the Kayapo Project, where he had basically, and that's how I got into this, the Amazonian Dark Earth, where he matched a indigenous scientist with a outside person, and so the indigenous scientists were all Kayapo. They did not have PhDs, and everyone thought the visiting PhDs were hysterically funny because they knew nothing. You know, like, what's going on? So one of the things is that was one of the big means of valorizing this. These indigenous populations appeared on lots of the papers. They went to a lot of the Brazilian science meetings and so on, and they've been increasingly included all the time. There's a big meeting in Leticia, which once again is now doing this thing of including indigenous scientists and indigenous forms of knowledge in what we would call a quote-unquote professional forum. So I think it's been a long time coming. It's been slow, but people have been arguing. I think we could go back to Kurt Nimuendaju in Amazonia, Kurt Unger, to those of you who know who he was before he changed his name to an indigenous Guarani name, was always arguing that they always knew much more than conventional scientists. So I think that we're in this moment of kind of a transition where basically it's kind of a joint learning thing. Again, the scientific panel for the Amazon keeps hammering on this point that you're never going to get a sustainable or resilient or even ecologically just form of regional economy and livelihoods without using indigenous information and not just like taking it, but actually both valorizing it and using it wisely. I just want to say one thing about Amazonian domestication, which I didn't get a chance to do. If you like chocolate, if you like pineapples, if you like vanilla, if you like peanuts, if you like chilies, if you like having rubber in your tires, you can thank a lot of the Amazonian population for that. And if you're, if you have celiac disease or gluten-free, you'll love manioc and sweet potatoes, which of course are also Amazonian domesticates. So if you want to think about a place that has been so generative, whose products you use all the time, and now chocolate's good for you, so. It's important to realize that this was a place of massive civilizations, and that, as Claude Lévi-Strauss would have said, and did say in the Pensée Sauvage, in the Savage Mind, that this was an immense capacity for science that is like a human capacity. And so just because we have one form of science doesn't mean that we have to eschew all other forms.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Susanna Hecht and
Thank
Infinite
you.
Winter Prince. I have a new motto: read widely and adopt an old dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks also for this award. It's so moving to get this, by the way. I haven't been gushing along. Anyone who's talked to me has known I've been gushing along about it, but not to the audience so far.
And now is the moment when we actually get to present that award. So I will bring this over.
Oh, do you want? I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
There are too many things to hold, so I'm not quite sure how to do this. Let's see. Here,
I'll
I'll hand you that first.
Okay, let's see what it is. Ooh,
I understand that it might fall out of the box, so hold it up with care.
okay, it's this. Oh, quite beautiful. And, it's a star in the middle of a planet. Here we go.
Very meta. Here we go.
Okay, and then an important document to hang on my... Thank you so much.
You want to do a...
Congratulations, and thank you for being such an inspiration to so many of us.
Thank you so much. Can I detach myself here?
Yeah. I think we can turn it off. So now we have about 10 minutes to mingle. Please come talk with Dr. Hecht.